I'll continue with something I raised in T-Ray, which is about fakes, really. So, it's not too hard to get your head into the non-duality concept. So as a shtick, it wouldn't be that difficult for me to develop it. So, how successful, how easy do you think it would be for me to fake it if I wanted to set up a business charging 15 quid a pop? And how would you tell me apart?
Can we stop filming at this point?
What's the hallmark of the real deal?
That's a good question.
Well, I offer online video via Zoom tuition to anybody who wants to set themselves up as a fake non-duality teacher. So I suggest, my rates are fairly reasonable, as in, it's only 600 quid for a 2-week course. That consists of 2 1-hour sessions. So, just talk to me afterwards and give me a last check. Other than that, I don't really know what to say to that. You have to just go with your heart and mind, whilst acknowledging that, of course, there's no such thing. There's just what's happening. Yeah. I think the clue is, if I or anyone else was to sit here suggesting that there was anything that I, as an entity, could do which would help you as an entity get somewhere other than where you already are. And obviously you don't need my or anybody else's help to get where you already are, because you're already there. I think that's a big clue. That's how I'd start. If I wanted to discriminate, which I don't particularly, but if I did, that would be my starting point. Is there an offer in there? If there's an offer, I'd run a mile.
Well, you're at half price.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there isn't anything on offer here. Not even the hope of self-improvement. Oh my God. I don't know how that would be. So yeah, that would be a starting point. Yeah. This comes out of nowhere, which is all there is anyway. And is perceived by no one, because that's all who there is anyway. This is nowhere full of no one. Just like everywhere else, ignoring for the moment, but there is no everywhere else, because this is the entirety. This is the whole of creation. If you've been coming to these meetings and other meetings, you might have heard the phrase, there's just this, over and over and over again, but that's what it means. Nothing philosophic about it, just a description. Just a literal description, there's just this. What does that mean? Well, whatever is happening, whatever phenomena are happening, there's nothing else, that's the entirety. This is, if you like, the whole of creation. No past, no future. No other time, no other space, just this. Empty. Emptiness, completely empty, apart from unconditional love.
What's the difference?
What's the difference?
Yeah, between emptiness and unconditional love.
There isn't any. There isn't any.
When you say apart from it.
Yeah, I know. It's a tricky thing to say. There isn't any. In other words, in saying there isn't any, I'm saying that emptiness and fullness are the same. They're the same thing. This is kind of, I want to say crucial to this seeing, but there's part of me resists that, because it's like, well, if I say crucial, well, it has to be. It doesn't have to be seeing, of course not. But if it's seen. In a way, it's like, that's the shock, that emptiness and fullness are the same thing. This is completely empty. It's an empty show. There's movement, but there's nothing moving. But it's also completely full. What's it full of? Unconditional love. How can that be? How can it be both empty or full? The mind can't compute that. Well, the mind probably could compute it and write 100 books about it, but it would be meaningless. But really just one moment of seeing, and it's just known. Who's it known by? By nobody. Why is it known by nobody? Because there is nobody. There's no one to know it, and yet it can be seen. There's no one speaking here, and yet speaking's happening. There's no one listening here. There's no one paying attention there, or more possibly not paying attention there, and yet paying attention or not paying attention's happening. That's really the heart of this. This is an empty show. It's completely empty, apart from that little tiny caveat. Unconditional love, which the mind cannot compute, because the mind does not live in unconditionality. And every time I use that word, the mind, I have to add the mind, which of course does not actually exist. What is the mind? An ever-changing flow of impressions. We reify it, we talk as if it's a thing. It's not a thing, it's an ever-changing flow of impressions. How can it be ever-changing if this is timeless, if there's no time? I can't answer that question. I'm just here trying to describe something that can't be described. What a job this is, sitting at the front of a room trying to describe something which cannot be described. I want to say this is so far beyond the mind, and yet I know in saying that, what the mind makes of that is, aha, now I have to go beyond myself and then I can get it. No, it genuinely is so far beyond the mind.
It's quite relaxing.
When the mind gives up, relaxation can take place. Yeah, but then the mind hears that and goes, now I'm going to give up. So, trying to give up isn't very relaxing, but when the mind does let go, yeah. And you missed the first part, so it gives me permission to say again something that I often quote from a Buddhist again, relaxation is the nearest thing to Buddhahood, right here and now.
But when the mind agrees with this message,
Yeah.
as my mind tends to, why isn't that the greatest trick the mind is playing?
Oh, it's a very, very bad sign indeed. No, of course not. It's just the mind agreeing with it. So what?
Yeah.
And then the mind being a bit tricky then comes in and says, oh, you very bad boy, you've just done something really bad. You've agreed with this. And that's, no. It's just the mind doing its old monkey mind tricks.
Yeah.
It's fine. Yeah.
Because I don't know you or where you're kind of, so sorry, I'm probably going to ask loads of questions. I mean, I probably have a sense of this message or whatever, but is there a kind of thing where, so I guess I've looked at different traditions and different teachers, and it's all a bit confusing sometimes for my mind too. But in a way I think that kind of helps, because then I can't get too fixated on one thing and I have to kind of let go. But it's just another teacher talking about this idea of the mind when it sort of looks at itself, like I suppose a meditative practice, when mind sort of turns into its own source, that there's kind of a relaxation that happens, or that it sort of actually longs to come back to the peace, if that makes sense, or the
There's
heart.
a longing, there is a
Yeah.
longing. I mean, we could talk about whether
Yeah.
that's to do with the mind or not, and
Yeah,
we'd say
it's
it wasn't,
seeking.
but yeah, an energy, if you
Yeah.
like, yeah.
And that's what drives people towards spirituality or meditation or prayer or whatever. Because the mind let loose causes so much suffering. And
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
for me, or for like what the life experience or the path of walk has been a lot of chaos in the mind, and then a real desire to come home or into a sense of calm and peace, and I often find that in the body, where there just feels like more spaciousness, or
yeah.
I just wondered. I don't really have a question there. It's just sort of wants to be voiced. This mind, which I hear you saying is kind of like a flow of impressions or thoughts that's ever changing. In that energy stream or in that flow, there's kind of a longing to I don't know, see itself.
Come home.
Yeah, the idea of self-inquiry, I suppose, maybe where I'm getting to.
Right.
Who am I?
Yeah.
Being a question that's sort of impossible to answer, but then in the acts of answering something there can be a dissolving or something.
Well, there may be, yeah. I mean, the main thing I'd say is that there are absolutely no rules about this.
Sure.
Absolutely no rules.
Yeah.
So awakening can come out of nowhere for a character, a person
Yeah.
who's had no history of seeking, no history
Yeah.
of thinking about this,
Sure.
no history of any kind of process, whether it be self-inquiry, or any one of the numerous other processes. Just come out of nothing, which is really annoying to those of us who have been spiritual seekers.
Yeah. All those years.
Absolutely, 20 years of sort of sitting cross-legged, listening to our knees groan, nothing whatsoever, and then somebody just, I don't know why at this point it usually comes into mind somebody's just sort of going up an escalator in John Lewis to buy an electric kettle. Suddenly there's nobody buying an electric kettle, and yet nevertheless electric kettles are still being bought. And it's so bloody unfair, because this recognises no logic, no reason, nothing. This is way beyond that, way beyond process. For some people are passionately, some people are very passionate about, for example, self-inquiry. Some people are very passionate about deriding self-inquiry and any other process and practice. What way both of those are just positions that minds take up. Minds that don't exist take up these positions. And neither of those positions, they're neither sense nor nonsense, they're just positions. And meanwhile, this just goes on being this. And there's awakening, but there isn't awakening in it. It doesn't matter, but it seems to matter, of course. It seems to matter to the character who becomes engrossed in this.
I find myself wanting to ask what happens in your story,
Yeah.
but you don't have to.
No, I feel like saying, why haven't you already bought and read some of the numerous books I've written around this?
Fair enough.
Well, if you want that bit, you only have to buy the first one, which is very short and very cheap. There was no interest in this. There was a lot of spiritual seeking, which I would neither associate with this nor not associate it with it. We have a guru and we meditate with the guru, and then the guru betrays us and breaks our heart, or we go to football and our team loses and betrays us and breaks our hearts, or whatever it might be. Here there was a lot of spiritual seeking. And then at some point there was an introduction to Tony, because he was giving his talks in a friend's house, and I was invited along. I was supremely bored. I remember that as one of the most boring afternoons of my life, and I decided I'd never go back. And then 2 or 3 years later I was invited again to a meeting, and this time something like that happened. There's no point even trying to rationalise it. You know, but you probably come across, and certainly other people in the room would have come across that phrase from Ramana that I've already used about, I think I've already used it today, your head is in the tiger's mouth and there is no escape. And I think that, I love that, because it expresses the complete illogicality, irrationality, and the impossibility of predicting this event, but also the incredible power of it. If it happens, I mean, your head is in the tiger, if you're seized by the tiger of non-duality, well, there's no resisting that. You go where the tiger goes. You don't choose where you go when the tiger seizes you. You go where the tiger goes. And in a way, that's a kind of good, I want to say lesson, it's not quite the right word. In a way, that's a good kind of example of actually how life has always been in the story of time, pretending for the moment that there's a story of time in which there's a history. What's your name?
Sarah.
So pretending that there was a story of time in which Sarah had a history, in which Sarah thought she was choosing to do things and so forth. But actually, that's always what was happening. Always what was happening was simply what was happening. And that's how it is with the tiger of non-duality. When it seizes your head, you go where the tiger goes. It's just that now you might notice it, whereas in the history of Sarah you might think, oh yeah, blah blah blah, when I was 16 years old I made such and such a choice. Well, no, you didn't, but that's how it feels. But when non-duality bites or strikes, sometimes it's just much more obvious that this is something completely outside our volition or our power. And then if we want, the mind can construct a story about that. Like, this has happened because of my particularly brilliant car, or whatever it might be. Or the mind can just collapse and give up and recognise the unknowability. Well, definitely the unknowability of this. Actually, the mind might begin to recognise the unknowability of almost everything. But certainly the unknowability of this. What is this about, the mind does? It's not about anything. It's just this. Unconditional love arising as silence and noise and stillness and movement doesn't need to be about anything. It's sufficient in itself, if you like. But that doesn't work for the mind, because for the mind everything has to be about something. I've often said this is hell for the mind.
All there is this is particularly difficult.
In what way is it difficult?
All there is this.
In what way is it difficult?
Well, it's only difficult when it's stated, because otherwise you don't think about it. So it brings up questions.
But when it's stated, what's difficult about it when it's stated?
I find it's a lot of objections arise. Just logical nonsense, really.
Yeah.
That's all. And something wants to satisfy that.
Yeah, sure. The mind wants to.
It wants to satisfy it. But of all the things that you say, that is particularly. That's all. I'm just offering. What's happening?
Yeah. I mean, in one way, I want to suggest, and you may not agree with me, in one way I want to suggest it's in the realm of the bleeding obvious.
Yes.
And all there is this. But of course, as soon as the mind comes in and starts asking the obvious questions, the questions, by the way, are so obvious that I'm not going to feed them to you. If you want to make difficulties for me by asking those questions, then ask them, because I'm not going to make it easy for you by giving you. I mean, the kind of objections the mind comes up with are sort of obvious. And then, yeah, you follow the mind, follow the story of the mind, and it's not just difficult, it's impossible. You know, well, fine, well, that's the mind. Fine. Follow the mind. There's no one following the mind, but the mind may be followed as long as the mind... Now, be careful with the next statement. As long as the mind is being followed, there's no chance of seeing this. That sounds like, oh, my, that could very easily be turned into a teaching. Oh, I've got to drop the mind. No, of course not, because there is no one who can drop the mind. It's not a teaching, it's just a statement again of the bleeding obvious that, you know, when the mind drops, the mind that doesn't exist, then this may be seen. Okay, well, what can I do to drop the mind? It totally misses the point. Not there's nothing you can do to drop the mind, but there is no one who can drop the mind. Nevertheless, when the mind drops, then this may be seen. But yeah, this is the entirety. This is all there is. It's astonishing and it's ludicrous in a way. And also it doesn't matter. That's the other thing. I mean, actually, maybe this is the crucial point, to notice the mind is, after all, a tricky little monkey that doesn't exist. Neither the mind nor the monkey exist, but nevertheless, as an image, the mind is a tricky little monkey and it's looking for ways to raise problems and raise objections. Why? Because that's what keeps it in control, even though it doesn't exist. Ooh. So, of course, the mind's going to come in and say, well, this is nonsense. All there is this. Obviously, there's a lot more than this. There's my mother and my uncle and my dog, particularly in your case, your dog, and you know, my blah, 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 blah. You know, well, fine, yeah. That's what the mind's going to say. Nevertheless, when this is seen, there's a recognition that all there is this. What difference does that make? None whatsoever. Other than that it's a recognition. It might make things simpler, that's possible. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter whether things are simpler or not.
But I suppose that the objections the mind raises is also this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
of course it is. You
there's
cannot
no
get
escape.
away from it. There is no
escape.
escape. No, running away from non-duality is also non-duality. It's, yeah, this is a total trap.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But all that there is a lot.
All there is a lot.
Maybe we have stopped seeing the sheer magic because it says, oh, all that, it's only this, it's only this, but this is incredible.
It is
a lot,
incredible.
and we are singing, oh yeah, it's all there is, it's all there is. No, this is something.
Well, it's more than magic, it's a miracle, isn't it?
Yes.
Out of nothing comes
Yes.
everything.
Yes.
I mean, that's the ultimate miracle. I mean, never mind stigmata and, you know, cures for whatever it might be at Lourdes. This is the miracle. Just that something apparently exists. Out of nothing comes something. Out of nothing comes everything. Yeah. Absolutely astonishing. There's no rules at all about this, but as a matter of fact, quite often when this is first seen, there is an experience of shock. And quite often when it's finally seen in its fullness, there is an experience of laughter. When emptiness is seen, shock. When fullness is seen, laughter. That's not a rule. It's not, oh, I haven't had a proper awakening because I didn't laugh. No, it's not like that. But it happens often enough to make it worth commenting on, make it worth noticing. Why is that? Well, the shock is just astonishing. This is completely empty. And then the laughter, the realisation that, yeah, it is completely empty, but it's also completely full of love. Yeah.
The attachment to the mind, or like the mind's attachment to itself. Like when you asked your question, I got a sense of like, yeah, it's the mind wants to be soothed by an answer. The mind wants to understand. It wants soothing, and it's sort of almost rewarded in the body of. Because then there's a relaxation that happens when the mind gets soothed. So it's almost like when the mind isn't given the food to soothe it, it creates stress in the body, and that causes a kind of suffering. And of course that's just what's happening. But I feel like there's some kind of like attachment or some kind of energetic holding or tightening or something that wants to be released.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And I know you'd probably say like there's nothing we can do for that because that it will either happen or not happen.
There's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
There's no one who does anything.
Yeah. And yet, and this is probably my mind coming up with, and yet my experience I'll use my, because
Yeah.
So my experience in meditation is sometimes like just by observing the knot in my body or the whatever stress, that just literally by observing, by giving attention to, but not trying to change the outcome, a relaxation happens.
Yes.
And that gives a false sense of like, there's something that can be done, a kind of observing, a detached observing. And that's something that I'm really hooked on. Like, I don't believe that that's not true, because that's been experienced, yeah.
It's a real experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I'd call that a psychospiritual experience.
Okay.
Yeah, it's as real as, the taste of Weetabix when you eat your Weetabix in the morning, which is to say it's both real and unreal.
Yeah, okay.
And that, talking about, that sort of, it's, those kinds of techniques, those kind of sort of what I would call sort of psychospiritual techniques of paying attention and they can be deeply healing and on a psychotherapeutic level.
Okay. But they're not.
And so can Weetabix be deeply tasted.
Yeah.
So it's like everything else. It's both real and unreal.
I guess there's some message that's been downloaded in me of like, if I do enough of that, then the big awakening can happen.
Yeah.
Or there's some path thing that's been conditioned.
It's totally natural, and for whether it's natural or whether it's conditioned, it is totally what most minds do. There is a desire, and then there is now there's a path to that desire. And it could be anything. I mean, in this case, we're talking about, however we want to put it, seeing spiritual development, seeing non-duality, or whatever we want to say. In another character, it could be wanting to buy a Ferrari. The mind's always looking for the next, the next fix. Yeah.
Like Lisa Kearns, she'd talk about like calming the person down, working with the person, calming the person down, and then that can kind of help with the awakening process. But that sort of, again, so she's maybe not as hardcore. You're kind of like neo-advisor. I can't even remember the terminology.
There's traditional advisor, neo-advisor, and pseudo-advisor. If you're not careful, I will go through them all and explain them again, which I've done many a time.
Like in a way, I guess the person part of me, it appeals to, it's sort of like, but I get it also, that's a kind of, I mean, if I can see that that's sort of a attachment to an outcome, then maybe that's not that useful in the bigger sense, but there's certainly pleasure in going on a path, I think, or calming the person down is probably quite rewarding.
Absolutely. So it's buying a Ferrari if you want a Ferrari.
Sure. Yeah, but it just so happens that this Sarah likes the path likes the spiritual path. Isn't that interesting for her? So that's kind of what's happened here for me.
Yeah, and there's nothing here in any way saying anything at all. It says, you know, in any way that's sort of wrong or anything like that.
Yeah.
However, well, you kind of probably knew there was a however coming, you know, to say, well, okay, so when I've done enough of that work, I mean, I've got a long background in counselling and psychotherapy and transpersonal psychotherapy myself. And so, it's wonderful for working on certain levels of the person, which this, what we're talking about here, has nothing to do with. And it is pretty offensive to the mind. It was some minds. It was pretty offensive to my mind to be confronted with the suggestion that these things have really nothing to do with each other. So, there's all sorts of things we can do to make, this more comfortable, or to make this less tortured, which it often may be. It's torture to be separate.
I know it's kind of what drove probably all onto this path. I'm guessing. There's suffering in, there's suffering in every life, but I think when
most of us,
when it's more extreme, there's a real hunger for it.
Yeah, I think there are rare cases where it's like there's never a need for an awakening because there was never a going to sleep in the first place. And I've met a few people who seem to be like that, but that's rare. So for most of us, there's the torment of life, the torment and the joy of life. And of course the natural thing seems to be for the person to do something about that, whether it's taking drugs or the much more intelligent thing of having some psychotherapy and learning to meditate or whatever, of course. But then ultimately, when there's a recognition, well, none of that had any relevance. But it's a matter. But then it is a bit frustrating to meet the person who was the one who was shopping for an electric kettle in John Lewis, and it was just a sudden awakening, and that was it.
It's not wrong to hate them, is it? It's fine.
It's fine, of course it's fine. It's not wrong, it's not right, it's just what's happening. Hating that bastard because they had an awakening, It's fine. I feel like saying ultimately nothing that the mind thinks about this fits. I was looking for a word there. It's not right to say nothing, everything that the mind thinks about this is wrong. That doesn't, but nothing that the mind thinks about this ultimately fits. Because of course, nothing that the mind thinks about this ultimately fits. And of course that's partly because, again, to go back to what I said, there's no such thing as a mind anyway. So the mind can't be right, but equally it can't be wrong, because it doesn't exist.
Jesus. Jesus.
I think this is the ultimate Zen koan. And the thing about a Zen koan is it can never be answered by the intellect.
It's kind of a relief. It's kind of a relief.
What's the relief?
When you said not, or whatever you said about nothing that the mind thinks about this fits, there's some like relief in that.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. When I came to this, questions, I had a very, very lively mind, and it went into overdrive. So that went on and on and on and on and on. I'm sure everybody in the audience got thoroughly pissed off with me constantly asking questions, and that went on for a certain time. And then it dropped, but it dropped not because any of those questions were answered, it dropped because eventually the mind got that they wouldn't be answered. And so it just gave up. I didn't give up, I couldn't give up, but it just gave up. That energy, I'm talking as if the mind exists, just that energy, it's like it's expended itself, the head hit itself as hard as it possibly could against a granite rock face for long enough to eventually give up. Yeah. Not that's not good or bad, but it is more relaxing. When the mind gives up like that, it's more relaxing. It's not better, it's not worse, but it's more relaxing.
Is that the fundamental difference between how you were before and how you are now?
What?
Well, I
I
know you
got
might say,
concussion.
maybe you might say there's no difference, but the experience, say, for the experiencer, or you might say there's no experiencer, but so I'm answering my own question. I don't know how to ask that, but is that the fundamental difference between how you were before?
No. Sorry, the reason I'm pausing is because I know what I'm going to say is contradictory, because I'm going to say there is no path. Of course there's no path.
Yeah.
And yet there may be an apparent process, and sometimes I know from talking to other people, this is sometimes part of the apparent process. Questions, sort of like a dog worrying at a bone, blah, 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 and then the realisation that, I don't know what, I can't complete that analogy, I wish I hadn't started it now, about the dog and the bone, but, somehow the mind just goes, fuck it. Fed up with hitting my head against the same brick wall. Yeah. So that's not, whatever the head it is we're talking about here, whatever words we give to it, which are inadequate anyway, like awakening or whatever, it's just something that sometimes apparently happens, and it's more relaxing. And I feel like if I ask this question, you should all be able to have chorus the answer, and what is relaxation? It's the nearest thing to Buddhahood right here and now. And we go on asking the questions until we stop. Those questions, there's no such thing as a right question, but if those are the right questions, nevertheless, they will never be answered. If you get an answer, you know you're asking the wrong question. But if you get an answer that makes sense, if you get an answer that seems nonsense, that's fine. If you get an answer that makes sense, you know you're asking the wrong question. What the hell does that mean? There are no wrong questions. And yet, in a way, if you're getting an answer that makes sense, the point's being this. How are we doing? Oh, we're nearly there. Okay, there's just time for one last killer question. The questions without question, all other questions, the unanswerable, ultimately unanswerable question. We've got about 4 minutes for that. Right,
I have a question. I don't know if it's a killer question, because I'm very new to this. It's if our mind is just a constant changing of ideas and it's like nothing, why are we drawn to familiar things?
Like all why, this is going to be possibly the most annoying answer in the world, I don't know. I mean, like all why questions, we can only answer it with a story. I mean, that's what a why question invites. It invites a story. So we could probably think of several answers to that question, some of which might make sense to you, or one of which might, and others won't, or whatever. Why are we drawn to familiar things? Well, let's have a story. Because my personality was shaped by the fact that my mother was overprotective and my father was too distant. So I'm drawn to certain things, like, for example, I'm drawn to women who are overprotective, and I feel uncomfortable in the presence of men who are, what the hell did I say? I can't remember. who are distant. You know, it's like I have issues with distant men, and I have issues with overprotective women. I don't know. Will that do? It's a story.
But if the happenings were purely random, the stories wouldn't be so good, would they? So the fact that we are able to make good stories is a function of the fact that the happenings that are going on are not seemingly random. There seems to be elements of causality and logic. And
clearly, this manifestation is not random. Clearly it isn't. Yeah. I mean, if it was random, then, I suppose as an extreme, subatomic particles wouldn't come together to form atoms. I mean, clearly there is, in this manifestation, there's order. Yeah. Yeah. I wrote a chapter in my last book about free will, and I was just sort of saying in that we could say there's three possibilities about the universe, which is, it's entirely deterministic, or it's partly deterministic or random, or it's entirely random, right? And you kind of have to explain those three possible positions to make sense of the argument about free will. But the third one is ridiculous. It is quite obvious that nobody believes that the universe is entirely random, and if they say they do, they're lying to make a point, as it were. It's quite obvious that nobody lives in that belief. So of course there's order, apparent order. In the manifestation, of course there's order, yeah. Is that a good note to end on? If it isn't, can anybody come up with a different note? Okay, I think we're there then. Let's declare the meeting over.
Thank you.
Thank you.